So it is easier, but it's still really hard. And the hardest thing is admitting to yourself that you're trans, because nobody wants to be trans. I didn't want to be trans. Nobody chooses to be trans. It is such a hard journey, even now. It really is.
Power to Live More with Joe Dodds.
Welcome to the Power to Live More podcast, all about productivity, organisation, well-being, energy and resilience. I'm Jo Dodds, and I started this show to enable interesting people to share their stories about how they use their power to live more, and by that I mean to do the stuff that they want to do more than the stuff that they need to or should do. It's about creating a life for yourself where you have the energy, health and space to be happy and fulfilled, spending your time as you'd like, whether that be at work, home or somewhere else entirely. That's your choice.
Hello. My name is Ellie Dodds and I'm co-presenter, and today Joe's interviewing Katie Neeves. Katie was introduced to us by Jackie Handy of show number 173. Katie is a woman on a mission, but not just any woman and not just any mission. She came out publicly as being transgender after living for 48 years as a man. Katie formed Cool to Be Trans to support and inspire other trans people and also to educate the general public on trans issues. She helps organisations with diversity and inclusion by providing trans awareness training in an entertaining way by using her infectious sense of humour. A recent participant in one of Katie's webinars described it as the most interesting webinar so far and definitely the funniest. Katie appears regularly in the media and she is on both ITV's and BBC's lists of experts. Back to the studio.
Today I'm interviewing Katie Neeves of Cool to Be Trans. Welcome, Katie. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Joe. Thanks for having me.
So start by telling us who you are, what you do, and crucially, where you do it.
Right. Well, okay. Well, I've been a professional photographer and filmmaker for 33 years. But 2.5 years ago, I came out very openly, very honestly, and very publicly as being a transgender woman after living for 48 years as a man. And so I now have a new business as a trans ambassador called Cool to Be Trans, where I do trans awareness training, public speaking and media appearances just to educate the general public about trans issues.
Wow. So normally I next say, how did you decide to do what you do? What did you want to do this when you were at school? And I guess you perhaps... Well, there's a whole complicated answer to that question. So tell us a bit about your story.
Okay, right. Well, so I was born 51 years ago, and as is still the established norm now, I was assigned a sex based purely on my physical sex characteristics, i.e. what was between my legs. I was assigned male at birth, and I was given the name Martin Albert Neeves. So that was me, labelled. However, at the age of around 3 or 4, my head and my heart were telling me something very different to the label that I'd been given. And one of my very earliest memories was age of around 3 or 4, where my mum caught me trying on a pair of my sister's knickers. And I remember when I tried them on, it felt so right. I felt right. But then she told me off, and then she told me to take them off and put my own pants back on again. And for every day of the following week, she would pull my shorts down and she was checked to make sure I was wearing my own pants. And it was humiliating. And it sowed the seeds for life, or not for life, but for a very long time, that what I did there was naughty, it was dirty, it was wrong, it was not what respectable people did. However, despite that telling off, the urge to cross-dress, as it was then, was always there. And so throughout my childhood, I always used to secretly dress in my sister's clothes whenever I had the opportunity. And whenever I did it, it always felt so right. But then those feelings of feeling right were very quickly superseded by feelings of guilt and self-loathing and disgust with myself. It was awful. And so it was many years before I'd even admit to myself that then I was a cross-dresser. I just, because it wasn't who I was or who I thought I was. So every time I did it, it would feel great, but then I'd feel really guilty, and then I'd promise myself that I would never do it again, and I tried so hard to not do it again. But however much you try and suppress that, it always comes back, and usually with a vengeance. And so this vicious cycle went right on until my mid-20s. So by that time, I trained to become a press photographer, and I was initially working on newspapers in Kent before moving up to the Midlands to get a job as a senior staff photographer with the Coventry Evening Telegraph. And I worked there for 5 years before leaving to set up my own freelance photography and video business, which I called Martin Neeves Photography and Film. So by my mid-20s, I had a successful business. I got married for the first time. And it was only in my mid-20s that I finally accepted and embraced the fact that I was then a cross-dresser. And as soon as I did that, it was like a whole weight lifting off my shoulders. I no longer felt guilty about it. And I realized that I had a condition called gender dysphoria, which is a great feeling of unease and turmoil caused by a mismatch between how I felt in my head and my heart, i.e. my gender identity, as opposed to what was between my legs, my sex characteristics and the label that I've been given at birth. And the thing with gender dysphoria is that it can vary in intensity, and it very often increases over time. And that's exactly what happened with me, and I was totally unprepared for it completely. But of course, at the time, I just thought that I was happy as a man who needed to cross-dress, and that was all it was. I knew what it was, and that was it. I compartmentalized it. I put it in a box. That was it.
Yeah.
And so I was, happy like that for many years. And my occasional cross-dressing, maybe once a week or something like that, was enough to satisfy the level of gender dysphoria that I had at the time. So by my mid-20s, say I got married and everything, but then my first marriage only lasted for 13 years. It was actually quite good, really, but we should have split sooner because my first wife never accepted my cross-dressing, and so it was always a bone of contention within the marriage. But also I wanted kids and she didn't, and it was one of those things that I always thought that she might change her mind as she got older, as some women do, but sadly she didn't. And so there were two massive things getting in my way. And because then when I was heading towards my 40s, I was thinking, oh, well, if I want to be a dad, then I need to do something about it. And with her not accepting my cross-dressing as well, I thought, well, so I instigated the first divorce. So even though, I loved her and we loved each other and we were a great team, there was those two massive things. So I instigated the first divorce. And then while I was going through my first divorce, I then went on to meet a second woman who would eventually become my second wife. And I decided to tell her at the time about my cross-dressing on our second date, actually, because I thought first date was probably pushing it. Hello, do you come here often? Oh, look, we've got matching knickers. It doesn't really work, does it? So to my surprise and to my delight, she was absolutely okay with it. And she... but there were conditions attached. She said, well, as long as you don't dress more than once a week, which in those days I didn't, that was enough to satisfy the level of gender dysphoria that I had. So that was okay. So that was a tick in the box.
Yeah.
And then she said, as long as you never want to transition. And I absolutely didn't. There's no way that I wanted to transition. I was definitely happy as a man who needed to cross-dress, and that was it. So that was fine. The other condition she had was that she said if we ever had any kids, she didn't want them seeing it. And I didn't really agree to that, but I thought, I didn't want to live a lie to any children that we had. So, but I thought, 2 out of 3 isn't bad. I'm fishing from a smaller pond here anyway. And especially as, as approaching 40, a lot of women that I would attract would have already had their kids by then and might not want any more. So for several reasons, I knew that I was fishing from a smaller pond. So anyway, our relationship blossomed, and then 9 years ago we had a beautiful baby daughter who was the absolute centre of my universe. And it was many years before we actually got around to getting married. And I always said I'd never get married again after going through the pain and the cost and everything of my first divorce. Mm-hmm. But I eventually weakened and I proposed, and then we actually got married in August 2017. However, about a few months before we got married, I just happened to meet a clairvoyant and a spiritual guide at a business networking meeting. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to any business networking meetings, but you tend not to meet people like clairvoyants.
No, I don't think I've ever met one at a business networking meeting.
To meet lots of people like accountants and financial advisors,
Plumbers and
utility warehouse salespeople.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with those people at all, but clairvoyants are just fascinating. And I was just so intrigued by her that I was talking to her for most of the evening. And she was lovely. Yeah, she's great. And by the end of the evening, I thought, I'm going to book up for a reading. And I didn't really feel the need for a reading, but I was just so intrigued by her. So I did. So I went along for this reading. And I tell you, she blew me away. She was incredible. She said so many things that were so true and pinpoint accurate, things that she couldn't have found out from my website or from my social media. But then she said other things which just didn't make sense at the time. She said things like, they make perfect sense now, but they didn't at the time. So she said things like a new way of being. And she said, there's an issue that you've always known about, but that you're not fully in integrity with. And she said, Spirit want you to go off into the countryside, take yourself for a long walk and talk to yourself, talk to nature and talk to Spirit, and they will show you what you need to see. Mm-hmm. So I thought, well, all right, well, I like walking, nothing ventured here. But I was quite busy. I was very busy at the time with my work, and it was the run up to our wedding and everything as well. So it was a few months before I had the chance to actually go off for this long walk. So in the meantime, August 2017, we got married. And then a few months later, so in early November 2017, I finally had the time to take myself off for this long walk. And I went over to Rutland Water because I absolutely love it over there. Mm. And I worked out this really long route around the surrounding countryside. And then I came back just along the South Shore. And I remember it now. It was a beautiful day. It was the blue sky, the sun was shining, and it was a very cold, crisp, clear day. And I went off with my map and my compass and my walking boots, and I was on a mission. I really was. And I was talking to myself and talking to nature and talking to the countryside, talking to Spirit, whoever they were. And I remember feeling disappointed at the time because I was naively expecting some sort of light bulb moment or some sort of voice to say, this is what you should be seeing. Strangely, Joe, that didn't happen. I don't know why. But weirdly, around the same sort of time, whether it's a coincidence or not, I really don't know, but it was about the same sort of time that my gender dysphoria went through the roof. It really did, so much so that I didn't know what gender I was at all. And I was in so much turmoil. I was even typing into Google, what gender is Martin Neeves? Now, I know that's crazy because the answer could only come from me. It couldn't come from anyone else, particularly Google. But I was desperate, and that's the sort of thing that desperate people did. Yeah. But I couldn't tell my wife about my inner turmoil because I didn't want to stir up a hornet's nest unnecessarily, if it was something of nothing. And also, if I did tell her, it would lead to her asking me questions which at the time I just didn't have the answers to. I really didn't know. So I just thought I really just got to face this on my own. So I thought, well, I better get some counselling. So the first thing I did was I found a counsellor who had experience of dealing with people with gender issues. And I had a few sessions with her. And at the end of those sessions, I wrongly concluded that I was gender fluid. And I realise now why I came to that conclusion. It was my fear of admitting to myself that I'm a transgender woman that was making me hang on to any bit of masculinity that I had. Mm. But I didn't just sort of take that sort of conclusion as read. At the same time as doing that, I was working my way through a self-help workbook called You and Your Gender Identity by Dara Hoffman Fox, who's a gender therapist from the States. It's an absolutely brilliant book. It's like psychotherapy in a book. And there's a lot of work involved. And it took me about 2 months to work my way through it. And by the time I got to about 3/4 of the way through the book, it became obvious that I wasn't gender fluid. I was, in fact, a transgender woman. And then by the time I got to the end of the book, that conclusion hadn't changed. So now I had 2 conclusions, but they were different. So, okay, what can I do now? So I sent a text back to the clairvoyant, and I should point out at this stage that she's not just some sort of mystic Meg sitting in a caravan with a crystal ball predicting the lottery numbers. Although, to be honest, with the state of my finances, at the moment, that would be quite handy. So if you know anyone like that, yeah, please let me know. It shows my age saying mystic Meg, doesn't it?
Yeah, I know exactly who you're talking about, though.
Exactly, yeah. I bet your younger listeners are thinking, who's that? Look it up. But no, she's actually a spiritual healer, and she's specializing in clairvoyant healing, and she's a healer member of the National Federation of Spiritual Healers, which is recognized by the NHS. So she's got some credibility about her. And she suggested that I go along for what she calls a vision quest session. And I did that on the 11th of January 2018. And in that session, it's a 4-hour interactive process. So it's a big old process, it really is. And she used techniques such as deep meditation to get me into a really relaxed state and to allow me to get past all my fear and to allow me to access my inner truth. And during that session, she didn't give me any answers at all. She just asked me a series of questions. It was question after question after question after question. It was relentless. Now, whether she got the questions from spirit or not, I really don't know. I haven't got a clue. But she just asked me all these questions. But she allowed all the answers to come from me and from my inner truth. And it was such an emotional session. I cried buckets that day. I really did. And it was at the end of that session that I admitted to myself that I am a transgender woman and that I need to change my body. And and that was really the point, that I really felt female, and I felt that Martin had stepped back and Katie had taken over, and it just felt so right, and it has done ever since. But so now I had discovered my true gender identity, but what was I going to do with it? Because there's one thing knowing your true gender identity, is another thing doing something about it. And I didn't want to be trans. No one does, as it invariably involves a lot of heartache and pain, as well as dealing with bigotry and prejudice along the way. So a really tough journey. No one chooses to be trans, but it's just who I was. So I didn't have the choice about being trans. The only choice I had was to whether I was going to do anything about it or not. And the research that I did that showed that most trans people who decide to transition after the initial loss, pain and heartache usually go on to lead happy and contented lives. Whereas a lot of the trans people who decide not to transition and to live their lives for other people, sadly, they're the ones that often end up in a cycle of depression and often worse. And so the urge to live my truth was just so overwhelmingly strong, because I was finally at peace with myself. So I just thought, I've just got to face this head on. I would say man up, but that's probably the wrong thing to say. Rubbish term, and I'll get told
I know what you mean.
I'll get told off for using that term. So my first challenge was to tell my wife, and that was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. Well, apart from admitting to myself that I was trans, that was the hardest thing. But apart from that, and it took me a month to pluck up courage to tell her. I was so worried. And in fact, I actually wrote her a letter because I was so nervous of telling her. So just in case my words didn't come out right, I could give her the letter. But in the event my words did come out right, but I gave her the letter at the end, just so she had something to refer to, because she was in such total shock. I mean, it was awful for her. It was a real bombshell for her. It was dreadful.
So how old was your daughter at the time?
My daughter at the time, she was 6 at the time.
Right. Still quite young as well,
and so anyway, she was obviously in total shock. It was just dreadful. And I should point out at this point that sexuality and gender are completely separate entities, and they're not linked. So in my case, I've always been attracted to women, and I'm still attracted to women. It's been one of the constants in my life. So it feels no different to me. But what has happened is that the labels changed. So previously I was labelled as a heterosexual man. I'm now labelled as a lesbian. Well, it feels no different to me. It feels exactly as it always has done. But obviously for my wife, the label hadn't changed. She was still attracted to men. So there was a mismatch there. We tried some counselling, but sadly that didn't work. So unfortunately that spelt the end of my second marriage. So it's a very short marriage, that one.
Mm.
The next dilemma I had was what to do about the name of my photography and video business,
Yes,
which is
of course.
very boldly and and largely branded after my old male name, Martin Neeves Photography and Film.
Mm.
Now, I could have changed the name to Katie Neeves Photography and Film, but the trouble is it had been an established brand for 22 years then. And I got lots of great reviews. I was and still am actually ranked second in the UK on Photographers on Free Index purely through customer reviews, and I had lots of lots of great jobs that I'd done under my belt. So I'd done it to a very high level, and I just felt that because I was well known and everything, I just felt that the brand was just too big for me to change it. And so what I had to do was just sort of step away from the brand a bit, and so just recognise the fact that instead of being Martin from Martin Neeves Photography and Film, I would be Katie from Martin Neeves Photography and Film. But in order to do that, I'd have to come out very openly, very honestly, and very publicly as being trans, and continue to do that.
Yeah.
So what I did was I decided to make a coming out video. And on the 26th of April 2018, I made that public. I sent it to all my clients, and I put it on all my social media.
Yes.
And I remember my finger nervously hovering over the mouse, knowing that as soon as I make that click to make the video live, my life would never be the same again.
Yeah, yeah.
It was horrendous. I was so nervous.
I can imagine.
Anyway, I clicked the mouse and I waited. But then I had to go out on a job. But my mind wasn't on the job at all. I got the pictures taken as quickly as I could. I was on autopilot, and the client was very happy with the pictures, but I couldn't wait to get back to see what was happening Facebook was the first one I did.
Yeah.
And I was so worried about it because my whole reputation, my livelihood, everything rested on the reaction to that one video. And the thing is that I didn't have a staff job, so I wasn't protected in law by any discrimination laws or anything. The Equality Act 2010 or anything didn't make a difference, because if clients had a problem with my transition, then they would just stop booking me and the phone would stop ringing. And so I was so worried. But I needn't have worried, because when I got back, I was inundated with literally hundreds of messages of support. It was amazing. I felt so loved. And I didn't do any work for 3 whole days because I was so busy replying to all these lovely messages of support. It was incredible. And it coming out went from being something that I was absolutely dreading to being one of the most uplifting experiences of my life. It was amazing. It really was. And as well as having lots of lovely messages from friends and from clients, I also had messages from other trans people who said that they'd seen it and they'd been struggling, and what I'd said had helped them, and so they thanked me. But there's one particular message that really struck a chord with me, and that was from a woman whose son had gender issues when he was going through puberty, and he was being treated for it at a gender clinic for kids at the time. And she said that she was really worried that at the time that he would either be bullied or he'd self-harm or even attempt suicide. And she was right to be worried, because the 2012 Trans Mental Health Survey by Stonewall showed that 48% of trans people have attempted suicide at least once, and 84% have thought about it.
Yeah.
And she said to me, if only there was someone like you out there at the time that he was going through this, just to let him know that it's okay to be trans, because it really is okay to be trans. And that got me thinking. I thought, I've really got to do some good with this. So I decided to vlog my whole journey, just bring everybody along on the journey with me and demystify the whole process, make it accessible, and educate, reach out to other trans people to let them know that it's okay to be trans, but then also educate the general public and just show them that trans people are just ordinary people who want to be safe, loved and happy, just like everyone else. And so I started doing that, and my story was picked up initially in the local radio. So I started doing interviews for them, and then local newspapers, and then it escalated, and I started doing stuff for national radio and television and national newspapers and magazines, and all of a sudden I'd become this trans ambassador. It just happened organically. And I think a lot of bigotry and prejudice comes from a fear of the unknown. So if you can take that unknown away, then you're doing a good thing. And so I think the more education there is, then the more acceptance there will be. And then the more acceptance there will be, the easier it will be for other trans people to admit to themselves they're trans, because that's the hardest thing to do, and B, to actually do something about it and start the transition and then live their best lives. As ultimately, that's what we all want to do.
Yeah. So do you think having your own business was, I mean, it sounds like it was almost a hindrance and a benefit, because, as you say, it made it perhaps feel even harder at the beginning because it was your livelihood, and it was only you that could control that, or rather the relationships you already had with people. But also it's given you this opportunity to be the ambassador and grasp things in a different way than perhaps you might have been able to if you were working in a corporate job.
Yeah, I think it made it a lot harder at the time because I was so worried. I was worried about losing my livelihood. And whereas if I'd been in a staff job, I would have been protected. Been protected by the Equality Act. So, having said that, not all companies get it right, but I would have been protected in law. So it definitely made it harder. But it has led to this thing, and I'm blown away by everything that's happened with this. It's really taken off, and I've had some fantastic opportunities. I've made my world has really opened up. I've just made so many new friends through this, and some incredible friends, and with amazing stories to tell. It feels absolutely amazing, and I've lost count of the number of people who told me that I look so much happier now, and I'm not surprised, because it's the real me. I'm living my truth, and that feels incredible. It really does.
Yes, yeah. So one of the questions I ask a lot of my guests is about how they sort of prioritize what they do between their work and their home life. And I guess you've got sort of two things that you do now, as well as your home life. We talked a bit before we came on about the challenges of the pandemic and lockdown, and how that's affected the photography business, which has given you opportunity to do more with the trans ambassador work. But how do you sort of do both things, and how do you sort of manage that against sort of having a personal life as well? Because when you're an ambassador, sometimes it seeps into all areas of your life, and you can't go anywhere without being that person.
Yeah. What personal life?
Yeah, exactly. I thought that's what you might say.
Yeah, I've sort of pretty much dedicated myself to this, and obviously, having my daughter is great, because then that means that when she stays with me, because she stays with me every other weekend. So when she stays with me, then I can't be doing anything else, and I'm dedicating my time to her. And pretty much the rest of the time, I'm just full on with this. And I, to be honest, I'm absolutely loving it. I really am. It doesn't feel like work, because I know that it's doing good. And even though, obviously, by putting my head above the parapet, I get a certain amount of hate directed at me. I mean, I don't know if you saw recently, I wrote an open letter to J.K. Rowling after all the transphobic messages and things that she's been putting out, and a lot of people were afraid to say anything against her, because obviously she's one of the most famous authors in the world, and so you know that you are sticking your head above the parapet big time when you do something like that. And so I knew that it would attract a lot of hate, and sure enough, they didn't disappoint. I've had over 1,000 messages of hate from that. But as well as having those, but they would those hate messages were generally from faceless keyboard warriors who were hiding behind their fake names and their avatars. So to me, those messages didn't count. The ones that really counted were the private messages that were sent to me by particularly parents of trans children, who said that they wanted to speak out, but they couldn't for fear of outing their children. So they really thanked me for what I'd said, because it needed saying. And so it means so much to me when I get messages like that, and I know that it's doing good. And a lot of trans people contact me because I'm fairly high profile now, and and they want a bit of support, and so often they're in self-denial at the start, and you just give them just a little bit of mentoring, and it's amazing just to see them blossom, and then they're away, and it's great, and then they're living their truth, and they're so happy, and it is fantastic to see. It's just so rewarding. So yes, it's time consuming, but it doesn't feel like work.
And have you, or are you thinking about sort of commercializing this? And I don't mean that in a negative way, but it sounds like a lot of the work that has come your way with this to begin with is supporting the community, as you would anyway. But it sounds like a much bigger, I mean, you just talked about mentoring people and so on, that there must be people who need help and people who need sort of consultancy in organizations, for example, around how you implement all of this sort of stuff.
Yeah, well, I do. I mean, I do a lot of stuff for free where I do help people for free. But I got to the point where it was taking up a lot of my time, especially when they wanted face-to-face mentoring and everything. And so so basically what I started doing, I thought, well, I better just try and put a limit on my and get on my time, the time that it sort of takes up doing that. So now I've put a charging structure in place for if it's face-to-face mentoring or anything, but I still do free mentoring, usually via Facebook Messenger or text or whatever like that, so that I'm still mentoring them for free that way, because I want to do some stuff for free. So I do a lot of that, and I do a lot of public speaking for free. However, whenever an organization has got a budget, then I definitely want to tap into it, because the call to be trans, it took me quite a long time to actually call it a business, because I felt guilty about charging for it. But I do trans awareness training, and I do very recently I was talking to staff at Aviva, the insurance company, and in fact they had all their top management there, and so that was fantastic. I was talking to Ofcom, Virgin Media, so I was doing training for them. So it's vital, I think, to have this sort of training in the workplace, because there's so much misinformation put out there about trans people, and it's so powerful when a trans person can go along and tell their story, and then educate people and just take them on the journey, to show them exactly what it is to be trans. And I think once people have met a trans person and they hear them talk, they can just see, they're just ordinary people. That's it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I sort of asked the question because I think often when people start with a sort of altruistic, supporting community type situation, it's quite hard to transition into that, as you say, that business mind, because you want to help everybody, but you don't help yourself, do you, when you give it all?
No, I found it difficult, and I felt guilty about calling it a business to begin with. And I was sort of calling it a venture to begin with, trying not to myself. Well, but then actually, no. The thing is that it does take up a lot of my time, and think, well, actually, if I'm going into an organisation, they pay for other people to do training for anything else. So why shouldn't they pay for trans awareness training? And so many companies, even who have got budgets for other training, they don't seem to have a budget for this sort of thing, and then they just expect you to do it for free. Well, frankly, why should they?
But also, individuals, you presumably paid for the counselling that you had as you work your way through your own journey. Exactly. So individuals are in a similar position. People want answers, they want support, and all pay for it.
Exactly. And the thing is that the time that I'm dedicating to doing all this work with Call to Be Trans, I can't be doing with my photography and video business. So, that business has definitely suffered. But having said that, I mean, that took a dive with COVID anyway. But this is the direction that I want to be going in anyway. I'm absolutely loving it, because I know that it's making a difference. It really is, and it feels fantastic to be making a difference.
Yes, yeah. So before we came on, I briefly touched on sort of cynical comments from less enlightened people. I sometimes see on social media, sort of talking about how it seems to be sort of easy for these things to happen, for people to come out as male or female or whatever the opposite to what they appeared to be, because it's more acceptable, and that there's sort of a bit of backlash about encouraging sort of young people to make decisions that perhaps they wouldn't have made ordinarily, and all that sort of stuff. And that's people who sort of think that it's a choice rather than not a choice. I think it's that there are more people like you talking, which makes things easier for people who are in that sort of turmoil to do that. You mentioned some of the parents that have been in touch with you. Talk a bit about that whole thing about it being a choice, or that people are sort of jumping on the bandwagon, or that it's fashionable, or whatever.
I mean, it is. yes, it is easier to come out now than it was, say, 5 years ago and 10 years ago and 50 years ago. It's just I look back and think, God, the people who did it then, the guts that they had to do it then was immense. So it is easier, but it's still really hard. And the hardest thing is admitting to yourself that you're trans, because nobody wants to be trans. I didn't want to be trans. Nobody chooses to be trans. It is such a hard journey, even now. It really is. And so nobody chooses to be trans. And certainly, I'm not encouraging anybody to be trans. And I couldn't encourage anybody to be trans. I just want people to be themselves and to live their best lives, whatever that is, and only they know what that is and work it out for themselves. I know from living a double life and living with who I was before, it wasn't living my best life before. And the best way that I can describe it is, are you left or right-handed, Jo?
I'm left-handed.
Okay, can you write with your right hand?
A bit, yeah. I'm quite ambidextrous actually, but
okay, but it feels more natural with your left hand.
Yeah.
So I'm the other way. I'm right-handed, but I could sort of write a bit with my left hand, but not very well. But I could learn to write with it, but it still wouldn't feel right. It feels natural with my right hand, and that's how it is with gender. So previously, I learned how to be a man. I was socially conditioned to be a man, and so I think I did a reasonable job with it. And the easier option would have been to have carried on living that life, because I had a good life, a successful business, I had a happy home life, I had a lot going for it, but I still wasn't living my truth. But now, even though I've lost an awful lot and I've gone through a very, very painful journey, and lost family members, and I lost my sister through it, and had lots of problems with my mum over it. I mean, my mum's getting better with it now, but I did have big problems. Even though I've gone through all of that pain, I still feel so much happier now. I really do. And it's, a lot of people talk, as I do, talk about gender dysphoria, but not many people talk about gender euphoria. And it really does feel euphoric to be able to live your truth. It feels amazing. I'm absolutely loving being the real me.
Yes, yeah. It's interesting as well, just as with any of these things, people who come out as gay or whatever, when people do that thing about it's a choice or whatever, you sort of think most people, unless they're like real, I want everyone to look at me because my life is so terrible, woe is me type people, most people don't want to go through all that trauma that you had to go through.
Oh, no.
Choice, do they?
No way. No, the easier choice would be definitely to stick to how I was before and just bury it.
Yeah, and that's not easy in itself, but actually to sort of press that button everywhere. I mean, we talked beforehand a little bit about sort of younger people, and in Kent we have single-sex schools in many cases at senior level, and so the children around, or the young people around Kent who go through this process are going through a process where they end up completely different in that school to everyone else, and they still do it, and it can't be, even if you thought it was through choice, you look at those scenarios and you think, how can people choose to put themselves in that situation? It's just
must be so hard.
Yeah.
And it basically all boils down to the label that we're given at birth, and it's crazy, really, because the thing is, we're all just born as babies with various bits, including genitalia and heart, lungs, brains, arms, legs, everything, and yet the only thing that determines this label that we're given for life is what's between our legs. And the doctors and midwives often get that wrong anyway, because there's lots of intersex people. I mean, they reckon it's about just under 2% of the population, which in this country is about the same number of people who've got ginger hair. Now, they're not the same people necessarily, but it's crazy, really, when you think, well, and it's just given just on the appearance of our genitalia, and yet because at that age, you can't tell what a baby's gender is, because baby can't speak anyway. So, it'd be too young to know. But and yet it's how you feel in your head and your heart. That's what's that's what is the important thing.
Yes, yeah. It's been such an interesting conversation, and probably a bit different to the one that we'd normally have. We haven't really talked about your productivity or how you keep yourself healthy and energetic to run your business, but it has been really interesting and really insightful. Thank you so much for sharing. A couple of last questions I ask everyone. One of them is, what about those days where it all goes horribly wrong, where you have a bad day? How do you deal with that? And I guess you've probably had a few of those in that story you've told us. How have you dealt with it? How do you deal with it?
I think often by talking to friends, talking to my daughter. I think having good friends. I mean, a journey like this is a really, really effective way of finding out who your true friends are.
Yes.
It's quite an extreme way.
Yes.
But I've got some brilliant friends, and they've helped me through all sorts of rubbish. So yeah, I think falling on my friends. I think that's what friends are for, and I've got some lovely friends.
Yes, that's really good to hear. And then lastly, what about those days where you get to live more? So that's where you get to do more of the things that you want to do and less of the stuff that you don't want to do. What are those days like for you?
Oh, they're fantastic. They're usually really, really busy. I mean, I just seem to fill my days with lots of stuff that I enjoy doing now. Things such as this, I love doing podcasts and things like this. And, it's just brilliant. It's just to be able to do this sort of thing, like every day is fantastic. I love it. Absolutely love it.
Brilliant. And just before I ask you about people contacting you, have you got any sort of thoughts or resources for people who are perhaps going through something like this and haven't really done anything about it yet and don't know where to turn? Are there any sort of
there are lots of places actually. There's Facebook has many faults, but one of the good things about Facebook is that whatever you've got, there's a support group for it, or lots of support groups, and there are lots of support groups for trans people. So I think it's just easy enough just to do a search on there and just join a few groups and just see. Some of them are better than others, so just go on there and have a look and just see see what suits you. And so I think that's really good. And I'm certainly benefited from a lot of support within support groups on Facebook when I was still questioning. I mean, doing that book called You and Your Gender Identity that I mentioned by Dara Hoffman Fox. You can buy that. I mean, I got mine from Amazon. I'm sure you can get them from other places, but it is on there, and that's a really good book. That's very, very good. Other places for children, trans children and their families. So a very good charity called Mermaids. They're fantastic. If you look them up, so they're really good. They support the families as well as the children. And there's other websites like Gendered Intelligence. They're good. GIRES, that's GIRES. And there's lots of information there. And there's also one called TransWiki as well, which can redirect you to lots of other resources as well. So that's good. Brilliant. And of course, there's my website as well. I've got lots of stuff on there.
Just getting to. So tell people how they can find out more about you and get in contact.
Okay, well, my business is called Cool to Be Trans. And the website is Cool. So that's COOL. Then the number 2, the letter B, and then trans, TRANS.co.uk, and then they can sort of contact me from there, and there's all my social media links and all that sort of stuff as well.
Brilliant, lovely. Thank you, Katie. It's been great talking to you today. Thanks so much for sharing your story with us.
Oh, you're very welcome, Jo. Thanks for having me.
All this information is available in the show notes. If you go to powertolivemore.com / in this case 198, then you'll find them there. And this week I want to talk to you about email management. It's March, as you know, and the theme for this month is Systemize, and within that this week we're talking email management. I talked at the Power to Live More Calm member call on Monday about one of my favourite tools which I use for my email management, and that's SaneBox. It's a tool that I use to enable me to slice and dice my emails. That way that I can see the most important emails in my inbox really quickly and corral all the other emails into folders to enable me to be context aware as I go through them. So what I mean by that is, for example, everything I put in my @SaneNews folder gets scanned. So I look through it, I scan through it, and I delete most of it and only keep the bits that I want to read. And I have other folders that enable me to go through and really sort of batch my email management. So when I'm going through and looking at either doing deferring, i.e. put it on my to-do list, delegating to my VAs, or deleting, then I can do that around a particular sort of topic or context depending on the folder that I'm looking at. So I have my emails paused all day using a tool called Boomerang, and then once a day they're unpaused, all the emails come flooding into my inbox, they get shuffled and sorted by SaneBox, and then I can just keep a focus on my really important emails that are in my inbox, and then the others I can get to at the time that I allocate to do my email management. We were talking about Inbox Zero, and I was reminding the people on the call that Inbox Zero doesn't actually mean that you have no emails in your inbox, although I do like to get to that state once a day. It's actually that you don't have anything in your emails that you don't know about, so you don't have any surprises in there because you've done the processing, the reading, the whatever it is you need to do in order to know what's in there. So there are people who have hundreds, and some people I've met recently have thousands of emails in their inbox all the time, but because they use the read and unread option, and they use colour coding and starring and all that sort of thing, they're really on top of their inbox. They know what's in there and they know what they need to do as a result of it. So it's not about getting to Inbox Zero, i.e. no emails in your inbox. It's about really understanding what's going on in there. The other tool we talked about is Pocket, which is an app that I've talked about before that I use to save any articles that I want to read. And that makes it really easy to delete newsletters that come in that have got links to online articles. I get the newsletters, I click on the links, go to the article on the web browser, and then I just use the extension for Pocket that's on my Chrome browser, and it adds that article to my Pocket account so I can go and read that at a later date. So no more of that keeping tons of tabs open on your browser, hoping that you're going to read those articles by the end of the day and then not getting a chance and just closing all of those browser tabs down. So Pocket's a really good tool. I use it not only for reading articles but also for research. If I'm thinking about sharing some articles around particular topics, I use the search function in there to actually find those topics. And I've had situations where I've been on calls. I was on a podcast or an interview of some description online, and we were talking about LinkedIn. And whilst we were talking about it, I was able to do a search in my Pocket account and find some articles that I'd read about LinkedIn, and I was able to bring some of the data, some of the information from those articles into the discussion. So it made me look, quite well read, well prepared, and actually it was sort of in the moment using the functionality of the Pocket app. And then the last tool that I mentioned is Shift, which is a tool that I use on my computer, and it amalgamates my email and most of the apps that I use on a regular basis into one place so that I don't have tons of windows open. So it's got email on there, as I said. It's got my Todoist, so my to-do list. It's got Evernote, Slack. It's even got WhatsApp and Asana on there, and Aweber. So I can go into each of those apps just from one window rather than having to sort of flick through and open tons of windows on my computer. So that's another tool that I really get lots of value from in being productive in relation to email management and apps and so on. And as I said, that's called Shift. So those are the tools. They were SaneBox. And if you go to joedodds.com/recommends/SaneBox, then you can get to that there. Boomerang is the one for pausing your inbox. Pocket is for the article gathering. And then Shift is for your computer to pull all your apps and your email together into one place. Next week, we're going to be talking about to-do lists. I'm sure Todoist will be discussed in great detail, as that's the tool that I use for my to-do list, but I'm sure we'll be talking about pen and paper as well, which seems to be a very popular option for my podcast guests and also for my members of Power to Live More Calm. Again, the show notes for this week's show are at powertolivemore.com/198, and we look forward to speaking to you next week.
Use your power to live more.